have been transported to a country far away from this country.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to the first AOH Cultural Heritage Hour. Today we are featuring Hibernian Talks with Irish author Kevin Barry, originally from Limerick, hosted today by our AOH's own Tim Noonan. I'm Danny O'Connell, the National President of the Ancient Order of Hibernians in America, and we wish to welcome you, our friends from Ireland, our friends from the United States. We are proud to have individuals from representing 30 different states join us live today. If you have any questions throughout today's event, please utilize the Q&A portion of Zoom. We will be doing our best to monitor the YouTube chat for questions as well. Following today's discussion, we will open up to live questions. Please raise your hand on Zoom to enter the question queue. We ask everyone to please minimize their comments as we would like to take as many questions as we can. At this time, let's welcome the AOH's Chicago Division 59 President, Tim Noonan, today's host. Tim?
Thank you, Danny. I'm honored to welcome Kevin Barry in a virtual book launch of that old country music stories. Amongst Kevin's many awards, he's being selected to be on the Booker Prize long list. He's won the International Dublin Literary Award. Kevin's short stories have been published in the New Yorker and in Granta. His books include Night Boat to Tangier, Beetlebone, The City of Bohane, Dark Lies the Island, which has been adapted into a film, and There Are Little Kingdoms. Kevin is here courtesy of Penguin Random House. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks for having me. It's great to do this.
Would you like to start off maybe with a short selection?
Sure. I just to give the folks at home just a brief flavor of the madness going on in this book. I'll read a couple of pages from the first story in the collection, which is titled "The Coast of Leitrim." People familiar with the Irish Northwest may realize that the coast of Leitrim isn't very long. There isn't much of it there at all. So we'll start with this story. Living alone in his dead uncle's cottage, and with the burden lately of wandering thoughts in the night, Seamus Ferris had fallen hard for a Polish girl who worked at a cafe down in Carrick. He had himself almost convinced that the situation had the dimensions of a love affair, although in fact he'd exchanged no more than a few dozen words with her whenever she named a price for his flat white and scone, and he shyly paid it, offering a line or two himself on the busyness of the town or the fineness of the weather. "It's like France," he said to her one sunny morning in June. And it was true that the fields of the mountain had all the week idled in what seemed a continental languor. The lower hills east were a Provençal blue in the haze, and the lake, when he lowered himself into it, was so warm by the evening it didn't even make his midge bite sting. "The heat," he tried again, "makes the place seem like France. We wouldn't be used to it. Passing out from it. Ambulance on standby." His words blurted at the burn of her brown-eyed stare. She didn't lose the run of herself by way of a response, but she said, yes, it is very hot, and he believed that something at least cousinly to a smile softened her mouth and moved across her eyes. He had learned already, by listening in the cafe, that her name was Catherine, which was not what you'd expect for a Polish woman, but lovely. At 35 years of age, Seamus Ferris was by no means setting the night on fire at the damp old pebble dash cottage on Dromord Hill, but he had no mortgage nor rent to pay, and there was money from when the father died, a bit more again when the mother went to join him, also the redundancy payment from Reltec and some dole. He had neither sister nor brother, and was a little stunned at this relatively young age to find himself on a solo run through life. He had pulled back from his friends too, which wasn't much of a job, for he had never had close ones. He had worked for 8 years at Reltec, but more and more he found the banter of the other men there at trial, the endless football talk, the foolishness and bragging about drink and women, and in truth he was relieved when the chance of a redundancy came up. He had the misfortune in life to be fastidious and to own a delicacy of feeling. He drank wine rather than beer and favoured French films. Such an oddity this made him in the district, he might as well have had 3 heads up on the Ramard Hill. He believed that Catherine, too, had sensitivity. She had a dreamy, distracted air, and there was no question but she seemed at a remove from the other mullockers who worked in the cafe. The way she made the short walk home in the evenings to the apartments across the river in Cortober again named the sensitivity. She always slowed a little to look out and over the water, maybe to see what the weather was doing. Perhaps she even read the River Light, as Seamus himself did fastidiously. He could keep track of her route home if he parked down by the boathouse, see the slender woman with brown hair slow and turn to look over the water, and it was only with a weight of reluctance that she moved on again for home. In the sleepless nights of the early summer, his mind ran dangerously across her contours. He played out many scenarios that might occur in the cafe or around town, or maybe on a Sunday walk through the fields by the lake. It was more than a slightly different version of himself that acted his part in these happy scenes. Seamus as a confident and blithe man, but also warm and generous, and possessed of a bedroom manner suave enough to ensure that the previously reticent Polish girl concluded his dreamy reveries roaring the head off herself in gales of sexual transport. Each morning, when he awoke once more in an aroused state, there was no mercy. It was of Catherine from the cafe that he thought. She was pretty, but by no means a supermodel, not like some of the Eastern Europeans with their cheekbones like blades. And as Seamus was not himself hideous, he felt he might have a chance in forgiving light. All he had to do was string out the few words right in his mouth. And we'll leave it there, Tim, just setting up the love story.
Indeed, yeah. Now you've written short stories and novel forms. Do you go about it thinking that, all right, this is going to be a novel, or is this going to be a short story, or do you kind of plan it out and then kind of fill it in, or how do you kind of go about in that process?
There's often when I have an idea and I'm sitting down to my desk, there's often initially a kind of a general air of confusion and befuddlement about what exactly it is that I have on the desk in front of me. Because I love the short story as a form, because I'm kind of a congenitally impatient person, and if you're lucky with a short story, you could have one finished inside a week, and that's very attractive compared to the long slog of a novel or of a script or something. So very often, if I have an idea, my first instinct is to try and see if I can make it work within the space of a short story, within a few thousand words. It's not always possible. The subject will often just not be contained within that shorter form. But I do really, as a reader, I really love the short story as a form. I think it's a very intense reading experience when you're in the hands of a good story. It really becomes an experience even more intense than the novel can be, with its lovely kind of looseness in that form. So it's I often try something in the first instance. I'll try and see if I can make it work as a short story.
So the short story is the first kind of where you go to first, and then it kind of builds its way out. So,
yeah.
Now there's in regards to the Costa Litrum, there's a sense of melancholy and yearning that seems to be occurring, kind of like a filling of a black hole. Yeah. Do you think these emotions are do they seem to be a theme throughout a lot of your writing, or just is that more kind of? Do you think that is more throughout the Irish writing in itself?
Yeah, it's there was a line in a review or in a piece about the book in the US somewhere, I can't remember where, the other day, which described it as heartbroken people up in the hills, which kind of covers it. But yeah, certainly there's a kind of and when people ask me where the classic question, where do your stories come from. I always answer truthfully that it almost always starts with a place, with a particular place, just some kind of atmosphere or kind of energy that a place gives off creates. It's something makes me want to respond to it with a story, and I start to place characters there. I've lived here in South County Sligo now for the last 13 years, and it's your stories follow you around in the world, and most of the short stories I write now have been within the kind of the Northwest and the interior Northwest especially. As lots of you know, watching, Ireland gets very different when you come off the coast road, and when you drift inland, it gets much quieter, and much more interesting in a way. And certainly there's that there can be a lovely kind of melancholy of these Irish places, as well as they can be very beautiful places. But it's there was a great philosopher not so long dead. He died about 10 years ago in County Kerry, called John Moriarty. And he used to say every field in the west of Ireland had its own atmosphere or feeling. You have happy fields and you have sad fields. He said you could walk across a field in County Kerry or in County Galway and suddenly be elated and be happy because of some actual happiness that was in that field. Or you could have a tragic field just as easily. And there are many of those around. But I kind of believe this at some level. I do think that our human feeling doesn't just exist in people. It goes into our places, and it leaves kind of atmospheres and resonances behind, and it's out of those kind of feelings I think that writers and artists and musicians often make their work, and that's what they respond to.
Now I read somewhere that you've lived in like 17 different places by the time you were 36. Did you get like a peppering of stories from different places? Is that kind of where you kind of bring them to in adulthood, or
it's unpredictable which places will give you stories and which won't. I mean, like my then girlfriend and now wife and I, we lived in the UK for a long time before we moved back here. Like we were in Edinburgh for 3 years, and I loved the place, and never wrote a word out of it. Never got a single story out of it. We were in Liverpool for less time, about 2 years, and I got loads out of it. Short stories and the novel Beetlebone. I had the confidence to try that about John Lennon because of having spent in Liverpool for 2 years. Felt I could do a Liverpool accent on the page. So it's unpredictable what places will give you stories. But it's I moved around a lot. It was only 2007 when we came back here, which was just at the kind of very peak of the kind of Celtic Tiger time. Yeah. We had, from having lived in so many different apartments, I think there were 60 something boxes of books. So we said, Jesus, we really need a place to put the books. It was backbreaking stuff, moving apartment. You were constantly loading up trucks and vans with all the books. So we found this old house, which is it's an old police station actually from a Garda station in South County Sligo. Used to be an Royal Irish Constabulary station back in the 1840s. It was built. So it's weird. I remember the first morning we came to see it and kind of looked in, and it was in poor condition, hadn't been used in years and stuff. But minute kind of came inside the door, just said, "Oh, here it is. This is home." You kind of it sometimes when you fall on the right place. So it's in terms of the writing, it's been good to me. The place has given me material, and it's given me stories. So it's the weather isn't great, but it's good. It's good in terms of inspiring short fiction.
Well, I know, at least living in Chicago in the wintertime, you can't speak too much about the weather. Now, so do you work here? Or do you have a spot? And in your work office, do you have it like neat as a pin, and so you have no distractions, or do you have like little props or something that kind of like, maybe like a horseshoe, or maybe something that will kind of drive you on to tell a story?
I work in one of an outbuilding out the back here that we've done up, and it used to be a holding cell actually at the police station. So I was sure there would be ghosts, but tragically there isn't a single ghost. I thought surely some tortured Fenian prisoner would be appearing to me, but no such luck. I would describe my office as hysterically neat. I'm very tidy in my workspace, which they say, of course, is usually the side of a chaotic mind. my wife works from home as well, and she works upstairs, and her office is just like, you know, a catastrophic mess constantly. I don't know how anyone would work with it. No, I tend to be very neat. I tend to and I'm pretty disciplined now in terms of attaching my butt to the chair out there in the morning. And you know, when I'm at home, as of course we're all at home at the moment with the pandemic, but it's I'll go in there seven days a week for a few hours every morning and see if something is gonna stir.
So do you just go sit down and just kind of see what comes to you, or do you write and then just kind of find out what kind of, and then do you do a couple hours in the morning, a couple hours in the evening? Or if you're like going through a novel, do you kind of say, all right, I need to block off this many days, or how does that work?
It's the best time for me to write seems to be very first thing in the morning, before I'm even properly kind of awake, you know. I don't even drink coffee first thing. I drink weak tea because I don't want to wake up too quickly. It's weird. It's I think the only thing writing is close to in life is dreaming. You know, it comes from the same place. It comes from that murky kind of subconscious place where our dreams come from. And like when you think about it, we're all brilliant storytellers when we dream. You know, these scenes present themselves with incredible dialogue and this mad kind of dream narrative logic, and then we wake up and we can't do it. You know, so for me, it's a case of like getting to the desk when I'm still in that kind of dreamy state and trying to write. Like I'll spend about 4 hours in there in the morning. I might be writing for 20 minutes of that, but it's a case of being available to it if it's going to come. You know, kind of being a pro about it essentially. Like it sounds a bit weird and esoteric, but when you say you're going to write, like. And for one thing, it's a declaration of enormous ego. You're saying, you know, world, shut up. I have something to tell you. I have something to say. But it's when you say you're going to do that, when you're going to be a writer, what you're doing is you're kind of making a pact with that subconscious place back here. You're saying, give me stuff, you know, give me stories, give me material, and then my part of the deal is I have to show up. You know, Tim, if I go in there 7 mornings a week, it seems to be going well, maybe one morning a week. You know, most days it doesn't seem to be going very well. I have a lot of what I call nothing days, where at the end of the week I look back and go, well, it's not nothing, you know.
Yeah, right.
Days and weeks like that, when you know, over a couple of years you get a book out of them. But it's a kind of a spooky art. It's a spooky business. It seems to give you just enough, often enough, to keep going back for kind of for more punishment. But occasionally, maybe once a week, you know, you get a half an hour or 20 minutes where the hand kind of feels guided across the page, and there's no sense of effort to it, and that's worth an awful lot. You know, those are the good days, and they make you feel like you have a use in the world, and it's what keeps you going back for more.
You know, actually, I was going to ask you about that. There seemed like another otherworldliness or haunting aspects to a lot of your stories. So just wondering, you know, and also there seems to be like a rhythm or lyricism to your stories. Is that, do you like play music or how do you approach
I don't, I actually have a theory about this, actually very interesting. You should bring it up. I have a theory that most writers are either failed musicians or really bad singers. You know, it's kind of a displacement activity. If I was able to sing sweetly, or if I was able to play the piano, I wouldn't have to write. I'd be fine, you know. But I can't do those things, and I think all writing and literature and everything else apart from music, all these things aspire to the condition of music. Music is for me the primary art. And prose fiction, writing stories, is kind of almost a disappointed musical form. I write with my ear very much. I write for rhythm. When I published my first book, which was a collection of stories in 2007, and started to do events and readings, it became apparent quickly that readers very much like to hear my stories on the air. They responded to them in that way, and it's become a very important part of my craft, really, to kind of, when it feels like I'm close to the last draft of a story, I'll kind of act it out. I'll do it aloud, and I'll have my pen in hand with the pages printed, because your ear is by far your best tool as a writer. You kind of if you're glancing over a story on a screen or on the page, you'll happily skip past all the evasions and the place where you're not really getting to the heart or the crux of the matter. As soon as you hear it out loud on the air, it's very evident where the story needs more, or where you need to take something away. It's by far the most useful part of my toolbox, I think, as a writer, is using the ear and kind of finding the rhythm of a story. I do think like that every story kind of has its own inherent melody or tune, and you're just trying to kind of pick that out as you go along.
Did you play an instrument, or do you like listen to, like, you a big jazz fan or
Oh God, no! I could never even. I think I had that. I think I bought a mouth organ when I was about 13, and kind of, so it sounded like a cat was being strangled in my bedroom for a few wins. It never even got past the kind of 3 chords stage with the guitar. I was in school. I went to the Christian Brothers in Limerick City, where I grew up, and I was in the pipe band because it got you an afternoon off to go to band practice. So I played the tenor drums, which were considered for the most unmusical and unpromisingly students. The tenor drums are the ones with the big kind of furry pom pom on the drumstick, and it's kind of a boom. So you learn the marches and stuff. And I never made it to the first team, should we say? I never went out for the St. Patrick's Day parade or anything like that. I remember I actually left the band because band practice was scheduled for the same night as T.J. Hooker, an American cop show starring William Shatner, that I was obsessed with as an 11-year-old, because a young Heather Locklear was in it, and so that was the end of the pipe band. I had to stay at home and watch
the siren song of Heather Locklear.
Yeah, that was it.
Does the state of wanting something in a now, in getting it, and then abandoning it, something like about the times, about like life in Ireland, and why is that? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, to have been out of Ireland for even if it was only nearby in the UK, and to come back at the time we did. It's been very interesting how much it's changed. You know, the late great Irish writer John McGahern said something very interesting once. He said that Ireland kind of skipped the 20th century in lots of ways. You know, it went from the 19th into the 21st, and there's definitely truth in that. Like, it's a very different country now than what I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and a much better one in most ways. You know, it's a much more energetic and kind of a multicultural place. But there's plenty that's been lost as well, and that I missed. But it's an interesting time to be writing about Ireland, because it is changing so radically and so quickly. There's plenty of material about.
It's funny you mentioned John McGahern. Actually, getting ready for this interview, I was watching some old John McGahern interviews, and he was talking about his books being banned. And he said, if it's well written and intelligent, it means that it cannot possibly be immoral. So that was kind of a very good way of putting that. So.
Yeah, that's lovely. It's funny, you know. I had a very as in my 20s, when I was starting to write, in a kind of a serious way, when I was trying it. I had a complicated kind of relationship with Irish writers of that generation. I didn't like them very. I was obsessed with American writing and American literature more so. Because I would read something like, I remember actually vividly reading Amongst Women, the McGahern novel, and there was a description of the bitter old father, Mourne, sat by the fireplace, slowly rotating one thumb around the other. I remember reading and going, Jesus, it's my father, you know. It was almost, that stuff was almost too close to home. Yeah, and I wanted to read away from that. When I came a bit older, in my kind of early 30s, I was able to read it more so. And like, very often, I think in a writing career, early on, you're kind of circling around your own kind of stuff. You're getting braver, and the stories are kind of getting closer to home all the time. But you have to kind of develop a thick enough skin to kind of go at your fundamental material, you know. McGahern had that very early. I think he was a very brave writer, straight out of the box in his 20s, writing books like The Barracks. He grew up in a building almost identical to this one, actually,
Oh, did he really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, in his father was a sergeant in Coothall, about 20 miles in that direction, in County Leitrim next door. So the building is very similar to the one he grew up in. Yeah.
What American writers have you think has influenced your writing, or maybe that you're jealous of?
I had a big phase in my 20s where I was obsessed with kind of the great American Jewish writers, people like Saul Bellow and Philip Roth and all that. And this was unfortunate in a way, because I was convinced I was the next great Jewish American writer. You know, this is a ginger-haired child down in Cork, and it didn't work out. You know? But also in like terms of the short story, things like Flannery O'Connor. Well, I was obsessed with it as well, and still am. It's interesting when you're writing about Ireland, when you're writing about the west of Ireland especially. I think a lot of the problems you have are very similar to the problems that writers of the American South have, you know, in terms of writing the speech and the language and the dialect. It could look like too much on the page. It could look like you're overdoing it. But then, you know, people from the South and people from the Irish West, you know, they sound like they're from the Irish West, and I think a lot about accent actually on the page. I think a lot about the different peculiarities of Irish accents. One of the very interesting things about Ireland is for like a relatively small geographic space. It's a small island, you know. It's you know, in terms of a car, it's like 3 hours wide and 5 hours long. You know, it's a small space, but the accents change greatly from place to place, and everything else changes with the accent. I think if you get the accent of your character right, you get their hearts and minds and soul along with it. So I grew up in Limerick City, where it's kind of 100 mile an hour, very quick, 100 mile. I'm down there at Colbert Station, come in off the train. It's this madcap, kind of crazy, bursting language that lends itself to a very kind of surreal humor and all that. Then up here in the northwest, which is only 2 miles up the road, 2 hours up the road, it's when we moved here first, I called it the land of the pregnant pause, because it seemed like they almost said nothing to you. You know, I remember one of the first days in the house, we had a local builder in fixing a chimney because crows were getting into the house, which isn't a great thing when you have a hangover on a Sunday morning and there's crows in the bedroom. But I remember in my kind of Limerick native way talking 100 miles an hour, and he was saying almost nothing. And I said to him at one stage, do you want a cup of tea, you know? And he kind of looked at me and said nothing for about 20 seconds. Then he looked out the window and looked over at the lake for about another 20 seconds, then looked back at me and he said, I don't mind. And I thought, Jesus Christ, where are we going with this at all? It's completely different. I thought they had no sense of humor here, but then after a while I realized they're kind of winding you up and playing jokes on you all the time, but it's very deadpan. It's with a very straight face. So there are these little kind of parochial and distinct kind of changes in Irish speech and language as you move around the place that it's very rich material again for a writer to go into, you know.
Yeah. So like when you were speaking of different accents and about the American South, like a William Faulkner, how he approaches is the language. So as you get older, do you see that your writing is evolving, or is it are you like writing more, or are you writing more dense, or how?
Yeah, it's very interesting actually in terms of this new book, that old country music. That my last collection of stories came out in I think 2012 on this side, Dark Lies the Island, maybe a year later in the US. But it's so I had 8 or 9 years of stories to pick from for it, and it's a chunk of time, you know, and it's long enough to see yourself change as a writer. I think I've possibly got a little bit kinder towards my suffering, misfortunate, broken-hearted characters. That first story in the book, The Coast of Leitrim, like I've been writing stories for 20 odd years now, and I think it's the first thing that's even close to a happy ending that I've come near, you know. And as I was writing that story, you know, about this kind of what seems like quite a doomed love affair, I felt a kind of sense of dread. I thought, God, this is going to end with blood on the walls, you know. But then it surprised me, and it went, without giving too much of a spoiler away, it went in a different direction, and it wouldn't have 8 or 9 years ago. So it's, yeah, you know, it's very interesting. There's prose style, a writer's style on the page. There's actually nothing mysterious about it. It's just a very direct projection of your personality. You know, it all comes out on the page. You can't hide when you're writing fiction, and it's it's as you change as a person, you know, through your kind of through all the way through your life, you're always changing, and it shows up in your prose style. You can sense it. I would say there's a kind of a calmer air maybe about the stories than the ones. It's natural. The stories you write when you're a stone mad young fella at 28 are going to be very different from the stories you write 20 years later on from that, when you see more of life. And I think it's natural that a kind of a more of a kindness and an empathy comes into the work.
Now, when you're getting older, that is the stories that you have in the book, are they from a period of time, or did you say write these stories maybe years ago and then revisit them, or how does that work? I mean, what makes them fit this book versus another, part of another book?
It's they kind of I searched around the house when I was putting the book together. I had about 20 stories in a roughly kind of finished condition. And I picked 11 that seemed to kind of talk to each other a little bit, that seemed to kind of reverberate off each other. Often it was just purely geographical, stories set in the interior Northwest, or in places like the Ox Mountains nearby here, which run between Sligo and County Mayo. So yeah, it's I guess it's a little bit like a musician or a band putting together an album and putting together an LP, where you look for a kind of a flow and a kind of a coherence going through the collection. It's kind of the fun part of it, actually, to put it together like that. But yeah, it's one of the great things about writing stories, actually, is, and this is something that the American writer John Cheever said in his introduction to his collected stories that come out. He said it gives you very, very vivid impressions and memories of where you are in your time and in your life when you were writing that story. That is a lovely thing. It's a kind of a benefit of being dedicated to the craft.
When I noticed that when you were in your short stories, especially that you start off with the stories with pronouns and then kind of introduce the characters rather than going straight to their names. You're kind of leading into the character, you know what I mean? I don't know if that makes sense. Is that just a stylistic way, or is there a reason why how you go about it that way? Starting with a pronoun in, or no?
Yeah, it's interesting when I'm thinking about characters, there's a lot of talk in my stories, in my work. There's a lot of dialogue, but it's funny. That's not usually what I think about first when I think about characters. I often try to think about how they hold themselves physically. How they present themselves in the world. Very often I'm writing about sort of Irish working class characters, very often Irish working class men, my own kind of background. And when you think about how a character from that kind of background holds it, very often it's very, very kind of defensive, stance, kind of shoulder out, kind of tense, knotted hold of the person. And in that kind of stance, there are hundreds of years of history and kind of religion and class and politics. It all goes into that. But if you can suss that out, if you can see in your mind's eye the way that your character is holding his self or herself, you can get an awful lot about them, and the speech will come from that. So that tends to be kind of the way into it. I just kind of picture, if I have an idea for a character, I'll try and picture him or her just walking down the road, and how are they presenting themselves to the world.
It's interesting you say that. There's I noticed that a lot. There is the relationship of the main character, oftentimes men, to women, and that there is a sexuality that's going on there, but not sex. You know what I mean? So I find it's kind of interesting that how the characters are relation to women. I think that's probably what you were saying before about put the shoulder into it. So,
it's and another thing that's really interesting writing these characters and kind of in their kind of heartbrokenness and the flirtations they're having, all the stuff that's going on, is that Irish people we're great talkers. We love the sounds of our own voices. And but contrarily, then sometimes we say very little. All this talk is going on, but sometimes we're actually giving very little away. It can take years to figure out the meanings of an Irish conversation. It could be 10 years later when you figure out what she actually meant. Which is, so much to you, you know. So it's interesting. There's all this great kind of cacophony of talk that's going on all the time, but it's what's not been said, just under the surface of the talk. That's where you'll find your stories and your dramas, you know, in what's not been said. And writing for fiction for me is almost the art of listening into what's not been said. That's where the characters start to give themselves away.
Right. In the story Old Stock, the protagonist's uncle Aldo, he dies and he gives the house and the land to his nephew, and it seems like the nephew is taking over the uncle's life at that point.
Yeah.
You know, he kind of like where the uncle had died off, he's kind of continuing that life on. Do you think the living can be consumed by the dead in this case, and so they no longer live their own lives, but more kind of continue on ones that from the previous?
The narrator in that story, the nephew who's kind of takes over his dying uncle's cottage in County Donegal, just up the road from here. He's a very kind of a shaky character, you know. He's quite unreliable, I think, in the way he does narrate the story. And he's completely uncertain of himself in the world. And he kind of takes almost the persona of this kind of roguish old uncle who was a kind of, seems to have been a kind of a bit of a madman, a drinker, a kind of a fornicator, all sorts going on with Uncle Aldo in his time. And he kind of tries to adopt this persona, and you can't do it, you know. You have to discover your own self. So the story's got to go in a particular direction. It was a fun story to write, actually, Old Stock, because it, like a lot of my stories start off looking like realism, but kind of go a little bit away from that over the course of the pages. And it turns out that there's something about Uncle Aldo's cottage that makes the gentleman possessor of it hugely attractive to women. And we have a couple of escapades as the story unfolds along those lines.
I was saying that to my wife about it's like an aphrodisiac cottage. Your protagonists are often like are first person observers and who look into the lives of others to inform them of their own stories, feelings and fears and desires, like the policeman in Ox Mountain Death Song, or Who's Dead McCarthy. Is this true, or am I kind of missing the point on that? And can you kind of go on?
No, I don't think so. It's those characters. It can be hard to figure out sometimes where your characters come from. You know, that Ox Mountain Death Song story, which is it's kind of like a nouveau western. You know, it's like a West of Ireland western. You have an old cop chasing a young outlaw. There's even a ripe widow in the story. I'm quite shameless sometimes about shoveling it on heavy. But that came to me in what passes for the summertime in the west of Ireland. I cycle a lot. I like to go out on the bike into Galway and Mayo and stuff for a few days. And for a few years, I'd been cycling over the Ox Mountains, which are really hills, about 400 feet tall. But in the grandiloquent Irish way, we call them mountains, you know. But I've been cycling over them for a few years. And every time I got towards the top, I'd go, geez, this is a really haunted, melancholy kind of landscape. And it looks quite epic in a kind of a reduced way. I thought I could set a kind of a Western out here. So I actually went out there for a few days with the idea that I would write a story on location, which made all the kind of incidental detail of what the land looked like, you know, very easy to do. But I didn't know who the characters were. And one day I went into a petrol station, a gas station on my bicycle to get an orange juice, you know. I haven't been cycling all morning. And I was just in the forecourt drinking the orange juice, and a police car rolled in. And a big fat old cop got out of the car and kind of waddled across the forecourt. And I just said to myself, there's one of them, you know, there's one of my characters. Now I just have to figure out who he's looking for. And that way I'll have my story. But it also, that story, that what kind of gave it to me in a sense was that my very first job in the late 1980s, I was an old-fashioned cub reporter on a local city newspaper in Limerick. So I would cover like the court meetings and the city council. And I remember at the courthouse there was an old detective sergeant, big old guy again. He was a good guy. He was a good cop. He was one of the good fellas. he was a nice guy. He would chat with the young reporters in the reporters box. And I remember one day there was a guy who was up about my own age, 18 or 19. He was up for something relatively innocuous, like stealing a car or whatever it was. And I kind of recognized him. He'd been in my school. And that old detective sergeant leaned over to me and he said, "You see this kid? He'll kill." And it was kind of a chilling kind of thing to hear, this kind of old policeman's intuition, about a particular young offender who we knew was going to go the whole way. I don't know if it worked out that way, but what stayed with me for years was this kind of sense of this old detective's intuition about someone, being able to read someone. And that gave me the whole sort of tension in the story then, where this old cop in the story is certain that this guy is going to kill at some point and needs to stop him.
How's your journalist background kind of fit in with your writing? Is it kind of make you more?
I miss it. I miss it, but I miss it because it's a very sociable trade. And here I'm kind of out in my holding cell, going slowly nuts, trying to write novels and stuff. So I miss the sociability of it. You get kind of you get a lot from, without realizing it. Like I worked as a journalist from almost leaving schools right up to my mid-30s, so it's added a long time. And it struck me years later when I wrote my first novel, City of Bohan. I got so much research for that novel without knowing it, by just doing those court meetings and doing those city council meetings and seeing how a small city runs, how a small deranged West of Ireland city runs itself. Yeah, that's all that material I needed for that novel. But it's I had some great jobs. I worked a shift for a while on the Evening Echo, which is the evening newspaper in Cork City. And I used to do the first shift, but I liked it. It started at 6 a.m. and went till about 2 p.m. And I used to like to do that one because I was in my 20s. I was often still up at 6 a.m. so I could just go into work. And my first job every morning was I had to ring every police station in County Cork. And there's hundreds of them, it's a big county, and ask, "Had you anything last night, lads?" What went on. And you get great material for stories in this way. They would never tell you unless you rang and asked. There could be a riot with 14 dead in Middleton, and they wouldn't tell you unless you rang them up and asked them about it. But it's it's kind of a job that gets you talking to people, and it's very useful background, I think, for a fiction writer. It used to be a very traditional way into writing books, but now it's much more typical that young writers do, MFAs at universities and stuff. My background as a cub reporter seems kind of like an antique world now, that kind of world of print journalism, which I kind of feel very elegiacal about and really kind of miss.
Do you, with being in journalism and that now that you're kind of in the interior of Ireland and Sligo, do you not have, and especially during COVID, is it, for whatever you're working on now, you don't really have that interaction except for what we're doing right now through Zoom and that. So is that kind of stalling your work, or did you always have novels in you, or how does that work?
Yeah, no, it's with the pandemic. I guess it's been strange to be at home so much. And it has struck me over the years that most of my stories originate with me getting out of the house and going around the place and talking to people. It's if I just sat endlessly in that holding cell out the back, I'll eventually start writing a novel about a guy sitting in a holding cell outside an old police station, and nobody wants to read that one, so it's once we all get jabbed up soon enough, we'll be back out again and get that. But it's been kind of nice in some ways as well. I mean, there are far worse places to see out the pandemic than here in rural Ireland. It's very different experience, I think, than in the cities. It looks the same out the window. The cows are the same old cows, and the lake is still there, and the fields haven't changed. Whereas, I had to go down to Dublin for a few days to record the audiobook for that old country music, and it feels much more dramatic when you're in the city and it's empty by 6 p.m. and it feels kind of eerie and kind of ghostly. So it's much less dramatic here. It's always quiet here.
Yeah, right. Very good. I know we're at quarter to the hour. I don't know. Do we have any questions that, if you don't mind, we'd be able to ask a couple? Maybe I'll ask some questions. Do we know if there?
If you don't mind, Tim, I wanted to jump in with a couple.
Sure.
Great. This was fabulous. This is something, this is the first of many to come. And I want to thank you for helping us, Kevin, get this moving. What a fabulous talk. I put a link out to the book on Audible from Amazon, and I saw that you narrated the book, and I already got a response from our ladies' national president, Karen Keene, who bought the book.
Oh, fantastic. That's good to hear.
You're going to remain on and listen. And, you know, it was a pleasure hearing you read a little bit. And this isn't as detailed, as deep as Tim's questions, but that's almost a 4-hour read. Do you do it on a couple settings? Is that one setting? What?
I think it took me about a day and a half in the studio, kind of reading a story, taking a half-hour break, going back to it. Audiobooks have really exploded in recent years, which is one of the happiest things to happen in publishing. I think my theory is that it comes out of people listening to podcasts. People have got used to listening to long form kind of stuff, so it's happily transferred to books. I think a lot of audiobooks are really bad because they tend to be often performed or read by very trained actors and read in a very actorly way, whereas I like to read them myself and bring what I feel is the kind of a more natural feeling to the characters and try their accents. I am kind of a frustrated actor, I guess, at some level as well. But they're very close. You know, writing and acting are very, very kind of cousinly professions. I think it's all about kind of hearing voices in your head and trying to make stories and sense out of them.
Well, I spend a lot of time in the car, so I'm gonna follow Karen's lead and purchase it.
Fantastic.
And it'll be the first audiobook I've listened to, and I got to tell you, that's better than listening. It'll be a lot better for me than listening to the news these days.
Yeah, for sure.
It's nothing but depressing. In your name, obviously, Kevin Barry, an Irish rebel. Was that by coincidence, or did your folks tie that in at all?
It's very strange, actually. My uncle was also Kevin Barry. He lived in England, in Norfolk, and in the late '60s, his son, who was Kevin Barry, also was killed in a motorcycle crash. And I was born at the age of like 18 or something tragic. I was born about a year to the day later, and I was named for that poor cousin. Going way back, my uncle would have been born and christened in the 1920s, so I imagine there might have been nationalist fervor in christening of him then. But it's interesting. In the early 90s, when I moved to Cork City first, before I started working, I was signing on the dole for a few weeks, and at the hatch in the dole office in Cork City, the lady told me there are 11 Kevin Barrys at this hatch alone. There's a lot of Kevin Barrys out there, you know. And it's funny. I only ever felt it had a kind of a serious resonance when I lived in Edinburgh, actually. When I was joining the local library after moving to Edinburgh, and gave my name to the guy behind the counter, and he said, "That won't go down well with everybody around here. Just warning you in advance." So yeah, there is a kind of a loaded quality to it, I guess, in some places.
Well, we have a couple of members on, Eamon Daly, who I told you is up in Drumnaquilly, and Ned McGinley, who's one of our past national presidents. And there's rumors that they ran around with Kevin Barry back at those days, and I don't know that they're quite old enough. But they might be close. Joining us next is going to be James Noonan. I don't know if there's any relation there, but we also have a question that came in typed in by Dennis Halpin. And Dennis, if you'd like to ask that direct, raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll ask that after James is done. James, welcome.
Thank you. Yes, I am related. Tim is my brother.
Hi, James.
Kevin, two questions. I read the story you read, The Coast of Leitrim. That was published was that the New Yorker or the Atlantic?
It was in the New Yorker. Yeah.
I read that story when you were reading it. Very familiar, and that's the first time. Must have been the first time I heard of you. But it really reminded me of the Irish writer William Trevor. And I wonder if obviously you're familiar with him, but was there any inspiration from him? And then the second
Yeah,
question I have,
sure.
sorry if I can, is tell us briefly about the inspiration behind Nightboat.
Like both the Tangier. Yeah, on William Trevor for sure. He was one of the, I talked earlier with Tim about kind of circling around Irish writers for a long time, but he was one of the ones, and definitely in the short story form I read a lot of. I love the kind of vaguely sinister edge that comes into William Trevor's work. Just in settings where you're not expecting it, kind of quite polite settings, but then this kind of sinister atmosphere appears, and he's masterful at that. I met him very, very briefly late in his life at an awards thing in Dublin, and he was a lovely man, and just gave off an aura of kind of great kind of friendliness. Nightboat, the Tangier, the recent novel. I had these two deeply annoying Cork City gangsters in my head for a while, called Morrison and Charlie, and they just kind of wouldn't shut up. They kept kind of I didn't know what to do with them. They kept showing up in short stories, and they would destroy the short story because they were too large as characters. And I eventually figured, I have to figure out who these guys really are and tell their story. And I set that story in southern Spain because it's kind of my favorite country after Ireland. I go there a lot, especially in the grey, wet Irish winter. And it's when your characters find their stage, their location, you can hear kind of a click. You think, this is right. You know, my two Irish gangsters down in the Port of Algeciras waiting for the Nightboat to Tangier. It felt right, and that novel came quite quickly. I wrote it in a year or less.
Kevin, Dennis Halpin has asked via chat, who do you consider to be the greatest Irish writer and why?
Well, you know, there are so many, and you get asked about the whole tradition of Irish literature, and of course there are many different traditions within it. You know, it's I think in the late part of the 20th century, Irish writing struggled with these two huge kind of looming influences of Joyce and Beckett, you know, who were very contrary influences. But Joyce put everything on the page, and Beckett came along and took everything back off the page. I always liked that kind of third way in Irish writing, which is a kind of mischievous kind of stream that went back through writers like Flann O'Brien. And I especially like Flann O'Brien, I think, as a writer, because he kind of showed you can have fun with this stuff too, and you can be roguish with it and make mischief. If I had to pick one Irish writer, it would probably be Flann.
From Kevin Heslin, when does Kevin feel that he knows how a story will end?
It's weird. What I often have when I start with a story is I'll often have a sense of the opening, and I will have a sense of where it's going often at the end. But what I need to have is complete kind of oily blackness in between. I don't want to know anything between the start and the finish, because there has to be discovery for me in it. I have to be, you know, being told the story myself as I go along, or it won't be good. If there's no surprise in it for me, there'll kind of be no fun in it. I try to remind myself as well all the time that I'm very lucky to be able to go out to my holding cell and make up worlds and stories. So I should be having a good time doing it. And it's a very simple equation. If the writer isn't having a good time at his desk, beloved reader isn't going to have a good time at the other end of the equation.
I gotcha. Welcome, Kevin Murphy.
Thank you. Hey, I just wanted to, I know you asked comments to be quick, so I'll be quick. Just want to say hello from one Kevin Barry Murphy to Kevin Barry.
Hey, Kevin.
Like so many were named after, obviously, the, I don't know, I almost call us an Irish unofficial saint, but I just want to say hello. And I'm a dual citizen of Ireland. We're from Cork and Kerry, and proud to be an AOH member. But Kevin, thank you so much for how you blessed us with your writings. And, you know, you're an inspiration. So not only as a namesake, but also as a great Irish author.
Well, thank you so much for that, Kevin. Really, really nice to see you, man. Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you. I'm with my son, Rory Patrick Murphy, who's scooting around my front yard, so I have to be careful.
I can hear him. How you doing, Rory? Good man. Yeah.
Hey, Rory, can you say hi? All right. Well, he said hello.
Thank you, Kevin. We're glad you took the time to join us today.
Likewise.
Harper Sperry from one of our friends watching on YouTube. I enjoy your style of depicting landscape in your writing. Besides finding inspiration from places you've lived, Have you taken any trips to literary meccas for inspiration?
Yeah. I guess actually the Naipo to Tangier novel came out of my very frequent sort of jail breaks from the barracks here, going down to Spain. And I first went to Tangier in the early 1990s for reasons that were completely related to the American novelist William Burroughs, who I was obsessed with at that tender age. And I knew that he'd written the Naked Lunch in Tangier, and that's the reason me and my friends were going there. And it certainly, that trip inspired a novel, but it took me almost 30 years to write it. So it's a long game writing fiction, you know.
Well, I'm sure it is. Welcome, Kevin Dooley. I'm
Yes.
sorry, Holly Dooley.
Yes. As thank you. I was wondering if there's any particular time period in history or something of a culture in the history that has influenced your work, or which has the most.
Yeah. Well, I would say my own span of time, because writing, like most of my stories are still set in Ireland and about the west of Ireland. And, you know, I was born in 1969, and this 50 years has been, you know, such an incredible textural change in the place in that time, in lots of great ways. Generally, lots of new tensions also. But I would say this particular time, it's you know, like the old Chinese curse, may you be born in interesting times. The west of Ireland has been through a very interesting period, and it's still trying to get a fix on it. You know, it's weird. There's a weird lag period when you're writing about stuff. It can take 10 or 11 or 12 years for stuff to kind of really form a narrative in the back of your mind. So it's very hard to write the story about, you know, why she left me last week, or why that relationship broke up 6 months ago. You're not bitter enough yet. Give it 10 years and you'll be sufficiently embittered, and that stuff will all come out. But in terms of a period to have inspired me, it's this one, you know. Thank you, Collie. Thanks.
Thank you.
Another question from Kevin. You said that music is the primary art. That said, who are your greatest musical influences?
Oh well, we could be here for the night. I mean, I guess I would have to, because I wrote a novel about John Lennon, Beatlebone. I would have to mention the Beatles. We should say that the Beatles are a very Irish band. They were all four sort of Irish Catholic background in Liverpool. And it's very interesting what happens when that whole Irish culture of kind of singing in pubs and all of that kind of stuff. What happens when you migrate that to the north of England, and what happens is a band like the Beatles and the Smiths, they came out of that very Irish culture that exists in Lancashire, kind of music hall culture of the 20s and 30s. But it's if I had to, Desert Island Discs and one LP would probably be the White Album by the Beatles. That would come with me.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, we're winding down here. Unless somebody raises their hands, we're coming to the top of the hour. So it's time for any closing comments from Kevin and Chris, and I'm sorry, Kevin and Tim. But before we go, I know Tim's going to mention it too, but Chris Cook is our digital coordinator. And without him, many of these things couldn't happen. Tim Noonan is also a member of our digital team that we have put together. And who'd have thought 10 years ago we'd be doing this? And I will say the first video presentation we had from Ireland was a live video in 2010 at our convention in Cincinnati, Ohio. And we had a young lady from Lifehouse Ireland out of Dublin speaking to us live. So we have utilized it, but not to this extent. When between YouTube and Zoom, we're able to have 100 people or so on. But Chris Cook unmuted himself there for a minute. Just want to say thank you, Chris. Any comments before we turn it over for the close?
Nothing from me, really. Just thank you very much, Kevin, for joining us today. Excellent hearing from you.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for manning the technology. Thanks.
Well, and then we have one last comment before we go to you, Tim. if he could figure out how to start his video and unmute our great friend of the Hibernians, Eamon Daly. Now, Eamon's just up the street from you a ways, and he also runs a wonderful cross-community project, the Omaha basketball team, the Omaha Thunder. And obviously, they're not able to do the live games this year, but welcome, Eamon. The floor is yours.
Hello, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can. How are you doing, Eamon? Nice to see you.
Oh, what a surprise. Thank you for mentioning me, Danny. And I've been living over here now in this summer, it'll be 14 years.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I love it here, the changes. I'm living on a family farm of 20 acres. So when you're talking about the people, some amazing things. Now, you were talking about language before. Now, I was lucky because I was the first of my family born in America. I had 5 older brothers and sisters who were born here in the house that I'm living in. But anyway, they say things over here that you have no idea what it means when you first come over, even though you think they're English words. And I'll give you an example. There's a queer boy.
Yeah.
What do you know? It could be 100 little different things.
It's it's a great country for eavesdropping, you know, because you just pick up crazy stuff all the time. And you have to train your ear to it, Eamon. And
I know. And the thing is, they're sort of like, they're all considered, yes, we're all nosy. Like they say, oh, they're so friendly. I say, no, they're not friendly. They're just nosy. They want to know where you come from, who your people are, the whole thing. And I find myself doing the same thing, especially now with this virus. When I see someone, I can see people coming from down the road, maybe when they're about 300 yards away. I go outside just to talk to them. So I'm just as bad. But it's crazy times we're living in. And thank you very much, Kevin. I really enjoyed your story and the way you thought about things. And thank you to Danny for letting me know about you.
Thank you, Eamon. Lovely to see you, man. Thanks a million. Cheers.
And buy the book, Eamon. Jay McCarthy, one of our leaders from down in Virginia, just wanted to say how enjoyable today was and to thank you very much. And we have dozens of others who have said that. Marianne O'Dowd had one final question before we turn it over for the close. And she said, what contemporary Irish writers do you like and recommend?
Oh, there are many. I would. There's a novel called The Art of Falling, which just came out in the last couple of weeks in the US. Same publisher as me, Doubleday. It's by Danielle McLaughlin, who's a woman down in Cork City. She had a book of stories a few years ago. This is her first novel. Absolutely stunning writer, stunningly gifted. It can be very funny, but dark also. So The Art of Falling by Danielle McLaughlin would be a recommendation.
Okay, Tim, it's all yours.
Thank you, Danny. Thanks, thank you, Danny and Chris for facilitating this presentation today. And thank you to Random House, Penguin Random House Books for arranging this discussion with Kevin Barry. It's been a lot of fun. I hopefully gained a lot of insight on how Kevin works. And if you'd like to purchase that old country music and Kevin's other works, there is a site, Bookies, at bookiesstores.com. And thank you so much, Kevin. I had a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. And I've really enjoyed your work as well. So thank you so much. And enjoy
Thanks so much. Thanks so much,
Thank
Tim.
you, Kevin.
It was great to see you all, and we'll do it again. The Zoom is one of the useful things I think that's come out of the pandemic. It's nice to be able to keep the connection going. So thanks so much, guys. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. We look forward to having you back. We'd like to thank all our guests attending. And if you send any questions after the fact, I'm sure Tim can get them to Kevin. But most importantly, get out there and